I think there's three things that define our economic system today. And they are that it's insecure, it's unequal, and it's unsustainable. Insecurity has been driven by the pandemic, which we've seen with the disruption of supply chains and entire industries. It's been driven by the impacts of climate change, we're affecting livelihoods all over the world. It's been impacted by digital transformations and AI, which we've all been seeing. And it's also been driven by persistent gender inequities, among many other things. But our economic system is both at the macro level and at the individual level highly insecure. Inequality is driven by our capitalist economic system itself, which is designed around creating winners and losers and enabled by exploitation. That inequality comes in the form of income inequality and wealth inequality. Let's be clear, today the richest 10% of the world's population own more than half of total income. And wealth is even more unequal. The top 1% of the global population own 36% of wealth, and the top 10% own 76% of wealth. Economic inequality, though, is not just about income and wealth. It's about opportunities, it's about access to social protections, it's about economic security, and it's about access to resources. And third is that it's unsustainable. Again, the nature of capitalism itself, which is underpinned by economic growth and the growth imperative, is leading to the rapid depletion and exploitation of all of our systems and the ecological systems that our very survival depends on. And capitalism depends on growth, and let's be clear that economic growth is essentially, requires exponential growth. And I think in the post-pandemic world, exponential growth is become more clear. Tons of CO2 emissions a year. That's 1 million times more than the average of 90% of the income distribution. So essentially our entire carbon budget is going to 125 people. So why do we care about this? And what does this have to do with social protections? Well, I think we've all been convinced that our capitalist economic system is the only system that exists. But let's be clear that that's not the case, and we have to be intentional about the kind of economic system that we want to build and that we want to support. And I think that system should basically try to guarantee a certain level of quality of life and welfare for everyone. And it has to happen within our planetary boundaries, and it has to happen while ensuring that low and middle income countries have the space that they require to grow. So, how does this relate to social protections? Well, social protections are increasingly being deployed in order to help address the issues of insecurity and unsustainable practices, as well as inequality. And what I mean by social protections are the kinds of programs and policies that are designed to support people's economic security. Social protections are not always the solution, right? We have to address the underlying problems, but they are an important tool that we have in order to support people's economic well-being and security. And I think it's important to note that the innovations and experimentation in social protections are happening in countries across Africa, across Latin America, and South Asia. These models are responding to rising inequality, and multiple formats and innovations are coming from these geographies. This is not a Western export. These aren't ideas that are coming from the West. In fact, they are coming from the global South and lower income countries, and countries like the United States have a lot to learn from these innovations. So I'd like to turn it to Congresswoman. First, I know that the Philippines is focusing a lot on creating a social protection floor. Can you tell us what the features of that social protection plan are and what progress is starting to look like?
Well, first, I wish to express my strong agreement with you that labor, or human resource, is one of the most important elements of the growing economy. And it is the bold action of the Philippine government, actually, in recognizing this informal sector by way of legislating what we call the Magna Carta, or Bill of Rights, of the workers belonging to the informal sector. Of course, we understand by informal sector, these are the workers who are exposed to low income, long hours of work, unhealthy and unsafe workplaces, and basically they lack the benefits and privileges which are usually available to workers in the formal sector. With the Magna Carta or Bill of Rights of the workers in the informal sector, it is the intention of the Philippine government to elevate the terms and conditions of employment of the workers in the informal sector to that of the formal sector. That would mean that the basic rights and privileges will be catered to the informal workers. And to add, we also have a current law on Domestic Helpers Act. That means that fair wages, right to rest day, and even access to social security systems are being provided already in the Philippines to domestic helpers. And further, we are implementing social security programs or social protection programs, which includes alcansya of the social security system that allows the workers in the informal sectors to continue contributing so that it will accumulate and turn into their social security benefits by the time they reach their retirement or old age. We also have the assistance to individual in crisis situation, which is an emergency cash transfer for individuals who are experiencing man-made or calamity-made emergency situations. We also have this tulong pangkabuhayan sa ating displaced and disadvantaged workers, particularly referring to the workers who are underemployed or unemployed by providing them an opportunity to work for a period of 10 days to 30 days with minimum wage, of course, given by the Philippine government. For the housing project, I wish to share as well the community mortgage program of the Socialized Housing and Finance Corporation, which is designed for the low-income earners, where the beneficiaries are given the opportunity to decide the type of housing that they want to avail of. By that, they are able to own their own house and lot by way of meager amount of income from which they will be getting their monthly amortization. And let me add as well, this partnership between the International Labor Organization and the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. We call it the Comprehensive Emergency Employment Program, similar to our TUPAD, that gives opportunity to our Muslim brothers to have this 10-day to 30-day working opportunity with minimum wage from the government.
Thank you for that. Saude, I want to turn to you. Tell us about the status of social protections in Nigeria. What are kind of the key developments, and what are the major constraints to implementing social protection programs at the moment?
Thank you, Terry. In the case of Nigeria, I think we've made a lot of progress since 2015. A lot of more concerted efforts are being made to entrench social protection in the country. I would say before 2015, it's not for lack of efforts. There have been several efforts spread apart. But now Nigeria is looking at legislation, looking at regulatory frameworks, and a bill for the social investment programs, which is a suite of social protection programs, has just been passed by the National Assembly. It also seeks to establish a coordinating office. I think we're currently running one of the largest school feeding programs in Africa, if not around the world. In my home state where I served, we had over 732,000 children benefiting from the school feeding program. And increasingly, we're seeing state governments take initiative. That's the subnational governments within the federation. In the case of Kaduna State, we've gone ahead. Our social protection, social security bill has just been passed by the State Assembly. And that also provides for the setting up of a coordinating agency, provides for funding, and it allows us to create new initiatives. We're currently working on the graduation program because we have the cash transfer program currently existing in the state. We have the school feeding program. We have several initiatives scattered across different ministries, departments, and agencies. And what we're trying to do is bring it all together so that we have a central place where it's better coordinated, where it's more efficient, And of course, this hasn't come without its challenges. I would say number one constraints that we've seen is the fiscal constraint. At the onset of the development of this whole process in Nigeria, we sought a loan from IDA, I think, for $500 million. The program is supposed to be scaled up, and we're seeking another loan of $800 million. So the resources are not readily available for these programs, and we're taking loans to fund the initiatives that we're seeing. But I would say one beautiful thing that has come out of all this is the data that we've been able to generate. We have a social register, which is really huge. I think it's close to 40, 50 million people at the moment. In Kaduna alone, we have close to 4 million individuals already identified on the social register. And it made it easy for us to reduce discretion when COVID happened, because we were able how to reach them, and we used that register as a source of data for providing interventions to people. So there's been a lot that has happened in the past few years, lots of development, and we keep working to ensure that things go the way they're supposed to go.
Thank you for that. You know, you mentioned the social register, and it seems that a lot of innovations are happening in utilizing data and new digital systems and digital technologies in order to identify the most vulnerable populations who we're often trying to target with social protection programs. Rufus, you work with displaced populations in particular. I think their displacement is obviously an increasing problem. How are you thinking about, and what are the key challenges for getting social protections to people who are either displaced internally or even internationally?
Yes, thanks a lot. And indeed, it's a very pertinent focus group of persons. And I think at the beginning point, it's good just to do a bit of zooming out and look at what numbers are we talking about. And just even looking at our region, that's the East Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region. I think the latest figures talk about 5.1 million refugees scattered across the Eastern Horn plus the Great Lakes region countries. And on top of that, there are 11.9 million internally displaced persons. And this is a huge number, because behind that every statistic there is individuals, it's families. And the most important thing there is the fact that a lot or majority of these people who are either refugees, asylum seekers, or even IDPs, they do not have the access to the different social protection mechanisms, because in most countries, and particularly for me where I come from in Kenya, refugees, for instance, are not included in the different social protection mechanisms that the country has, and that is by law. But before even that, if you zoom out a little bit again, I think the International Labour Organization does this annual kind of reports, and I think one of the things that they talked about by the end of 2022, globally, there were 4.1 billion individuals worldwide who had no access to social protection. So if you do quick math in terms of what we are as a population, as a nation, as a globe, that's quite a lot of individuals. But maybe, and that really helps to frame some of the big ideas or what is it that needs to be done. I think one of the things that definitely accruing to the fact that a lot of these vulnerable populations, refugees or even migrants, and here you're talking about whether those who are regular migrants or irregular migrants, is the inclusion of this population in the national social safety programs that the government have. And there are good examples that have been within the region. If I look at Kenya or even Ethiopia, Kenya, we have our national, we call it the national hunger safety net that has been very instrumental, particularly for vulnerable populations when there is episodes of drought, like just what has been experienced now. And also Ethiopia has a similar one. And it really uses the modality of either cash programs. But then if you now cross over to aspects like access to health, that becomes a very big challenge, particularly for refugees, both those who are in the camps or even those in the urban settings. Although there are still also good examples that we can point to. Again, looking to Rwanda here, I know UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, as well as also in the Kenyan context, there has been an inclusion, or at least trying to do a bit of cushioning such that refugees can be able to access the National Health Insurance Fund. But then that needs to be scaled up because that's only a small population. But even if you extrapolate that and talk about possibly the irregular migrants who are largely operating in formal or in very informal employment, the fact that they are not able to access or whether contributory or non-contributory to some of these schemes, that's a big kind of missing link. And there, if you are an economist, if you are even from the government, extending the tax base, for instance, if you allow regular or even refugees to access or even to contribute, it also increases the tax base for which the government can be able to really draw. So I think one of the thing for me, it's the aspect about inclusion into the national social safety net programs or even social protection mechanisms. I think the second thing that, because this panel also tries to look at the insecurities that come from instance from the issue of climate change. A lot of our region, still a lot of our farmers really rely on rain-fed primarily agriculture. But because of the challenge of the, now we are seeing much more frequent different droughts or even floods, I think the new innovations around there is the aspect about extending or at least introducing things like crop insurance in case of crop failure or even livestock insurances. World Bank has been, and actually now they are implementing a big program within the region, Eastern Horn of Africa, but the thing there is to be able then to tailor it and to open it much more, particularly in terms of involving private sector, because at the moment it's still been very much a subsidy type of a program. So I think for me that would be important. And then the last thing maybe before I drop off here, because we've been talking a lot about the gig economy and the whole conversation about how do we rope in digital economy. Again, if you look at the population we are talking about, refugees or even migrants, a lot of them, owing to the challenges of access to documentation, they are really not able to perhaps be able to access or even to be able to have the opportunities. But I think for me, digital economy provides then another opportunity that really can help people who are living on the fringes to be able to be included. And we can come back to talking about the aspect of financial inclusion for this specific group of people. Thanks.
Thank you, Rufus. I'm glad that you mentioned both health insurance, because I think that's a key piece of the social protection discussion, right? We can't really have social protections unless we have access to healthcare and affordable healthcare at that. And also, your mention of the digital transformations that are happening and the massive change that that's having in the workplace and the possibilities that that presents in terms of formalizing or the possibility of formalizing some labor, both very important points. I want to try to come back to you at a later point if we have time to discuss irregular migrants and migrants in general at the international level. But let's see if we have time to come back to that. But Florencia, I want to turn to you. As I mentioned at the beginning, Latin America has been really a leader in the space of social protections forever. What's the status in Argentina? Are there new interesting developments or trends that you can share with us?
Thank you very much, Terry, for the question and for the opportunity to discuss this topic here. And as you raised the point, in Latin America during the last 2 decades, there has been a clear paradigm shift in how we conceive social protection and social policy. And we have moved from a principle of contribution and benefits for formal workers towards making strides towards universalism. Still stratified, but at least it's progressing towards that direction. So we started kind of breaking this social policy divide between what's the formal economy and the rest of the economy regarding these benefits. So this has implied an expansion of redistributive and social welfare policies all around the region. In Argentina, more precisely, we have increased social public spending, and this has translated into increased coverage in pensions, for example, with a huge increase in coverage for women that we know that due to their contribution to the unpaid economy, their contribution had been lower. So today we have even higher coverage for women than for men, thanks to a moratorium and different measures that have been implemented. We have also family allowances for children from more deprived contexts, which were previously restricted for families with formal workers. We have also made improvements in terms of domestic workers, as the Congresswomen have also mentioned, that I think it's worth mentioning how out of the around 40 countries that have ratified ILO Convention on domestic workers, most of them are in the Global South. So that's also a lesson to learn from our regions. And at the same time of having all these programs, there has also been improvements in terms of the legal and constitutional framework to grant the right to social protection. But of course, this sustained progress in terms of institutional design and also in increased coverage is not without its challenges to translate this into improved livelihoods. And I think there are two main points that it's needed to address for social protection programs to be truly transformative in this sense. That on the one hand, we need to improve coordination of social protection systems because sometimes these interventions are designed maybe in a patchwork or a siloed design that does not help to the coherence and the proper coverage and adequacy of these rights. And how this sometimes can raise points regarding to regressivity or disparities within the system. So I think it's really important to properly coordinate, articulate both horizontally and vertically, especially in federal governments. And I think it's also important to raise the point regarding the two-way relationship between solid social protection systems and inclusive growth. So on the one hand, social protection helps support people and communities in coping with unexpected shocks, with crises, and unforeseen circumstances that affect their livelihoods. But at the same time, we also need stable economic conditions for these social protection systems to be truly progressive, equitable, and sustainable. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Florencia. I'm glad that you brought up the gender perspective because I think we know that in every country, women have less access to social protections than men. And less access, but also when they do have access to social protections, it's often less because women are disproportionately in the informal sector. And when social protections are linked to work, women make lower contributions. And so I think the gender perspective is a super important one that we have to consider. Congresswoman, I'm going to turn it back to you. I think, we kind of assume that social protections are great and, everyone wants that. But in many ways, if we really think about social protections, implementing them in a universal way disrupts a lot of power structures that are really deeply embedded in society and in our economy. And I think there's a lot of people who are not happy about that and who maybe do not support that agenda. And I think there's a lot of pushback in expanding rights and access to social protections, especially because they tend to support the most marginalized communities. How have you seen, is there demand from your constituents for social protections? Do you see pushback? Is there a lot of concern about social protections? What's the general thing that you see from your constituents?
Well, I believe that there is a general appreciation about our social protection program because we recognize that we have a margin or a large number of people belonging to the sector of informal sector, workers of informal sector. And this is the reason why the Philippines actually, not only the government, but the general public actually support our social protection programs.
I'm glad to hear that. That's good news. That's a promising thing. Saude, I want to turn it to you. In your view, can social protections be an antidote to insecurity? And how do you think, if at all, do you think the social protections or expansion of social protections can help to expand other goals under the SDGs?
Okay. So in terms of security, I think social protection works in two ways. It can help provide support where we see the aftermaths of security challenges. For instance, in my home state, we've had several issues with insecurity, with kidnappings and banditry. And where we have social protection systems in place, you're able to provide the support that for people who are victims of these atrocities. On the flip side, social protection can also help prevent those situations because if we want to drill down to the root causes of insecurity or, kidnappings, banditry, you drill down to the people who perpetrate these heinous acts and you find that a lot of them are uneducated, a lot of them don't have jobs, a lot of them don't have steady streams of income, they don't have a lot of trust in the government. So there's also the bits of social cohesion and just general distrust in the system, which lets them take matters into their hands. So if we look at social protection, for instance, where for instance, conditional cash transfers, which are tied to conditions like letting children go to school, they get education early, they have a better chance at life. They're likely to get better jobs, they're likely to be absorbed in the formal sector, they're able to contribute, and they're able to take when they need to take from the social protection systems that are available. So it works both ways. In terms of the SDGs, social protection is at the heart of most of the SDGs. One, no poverty, no hunger, and it goes on and on and on, education. So I believe social protection is a strong tool if we're going to achieve the 2030 goals that have been set. It's a lot of work. A lot of resources are needed, a lot of capacity is needed, but with the steps we're taking, I think we can eventually get there, and this will be a veritable tool to achieving those goals.
Thank you. It sort of links to the conversation we were having last night, what you mentioned at the beginning of your intervention, which is that social protections and providing support to people and opportunities can help to prevent a lot of the conflicts and issues that we face. And so in making those investments, even though in resource scarce settings, it might seem like a huge investment, but it can have a lot of co-benefits as well in the short and long term. I want to make sure that we do give the audience a chance to ask questions. So if you do have questions, please find your way to the mics, which I don't see set up. Okay, I think they're bringing mics. So if you have questions, please find your way to those. In the meantime, Rufus, I wanted to come back to you on migration. So displaced populations in particular and refugees have a particular set of challenges and issues in terms of providing and accessing social protections, but even more broadly, migrants, for any reason, whether it's for education, for healthcare, for economic opportunities, still often face major barriers to accessing social protections in the country in which they are living. Have you heard of or seen any opportunities for international systems of social protections that might be able to address that issue so that people, whenever they're anywhere, are able to ensure that they're able to access basic social protections?
Yeah, many thanks for that. And I think even just one step to answering that question, I think when you look particularly for migrants, whether they are outgoing because of regular process, like you said, whether it's education or even better greener pastures, but through the legal way, or even the irregular migrants who then make the dangerous journeys. I think one way that would be very helpful is, for instance, on the aspect about even when they get onto whether it's Europe, whether it's to the West, because the biggest challenge they face then is on two fronts. One, proper documentation, and then secondly, in terms of then regularizing their status, because then that also still becomes a very big barrier to, for instance, whether they can be able to contribute or even to be part of or to benefit from some of the, what you'd say, like the country of immigration where they have gone to. So I think for me, first trying to address those particular barriers, because the reality, if you, and I'm sure many of us, or for most of you who come from Europe, there's already a labor deficit. There's already need to be able then to provide, whether it's more or less what you would call the low-skilled type of work. So, of course, within the European Union and within the bigger discussion about mitigating inflows of refugees or migrants into Europe, I think being able to have that very honest conversation and to look at what are the innovative ways first, irrespective of whether in terms of how someone came on board, to be able then to look at how do we then process or at least support in terms of the regularization of their status, but then more importantly, then looking at the specific internal legislation, because indeed, in the whole conversation, you recall back in 2015 when there's a big headlines about European crisis, part of the conversation then still that was never given a lot of light is how can there be better labor agreements or better labor kind of compacts that can be made between different kind of countries that really help, first of all, to be able to help these persons who have come into the country in terms of different ways. But for me, I think the underscoring part is the bit about documentation, but also the regularization of their status. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I see that we do have one question here, so please.
Great. Thank you very much for the very amazing panel. My name is Edwin Rege. I'm a social policy, public policy researcher based in Nairobi. So my question, for the most part, the question is about sustainability, and this is especially with the context of social protection programs in Africa. Increasingly, they have been politicized, and with populist politics, where you find politicians trying to galvanize support and promising, like in the case of Kenya, if you vote for me, I will guarantee that every household is going to get 6,000 shillings every month. These promises are being made in the context of budget deficits, and I will want to hear your thoughts, even in the case of Latin America and the Philippines. What are creative alternative financing frameworks that can be employed to finance social protection programs? The comment, increasingly in development discourse, I feel like social protection and cash transfers and anti-poverty transfers have become like the new fad, the new elixir to end poverty. And there's an increasing, should I say, Western gaze towards African poverty or global South poverty, which could be problematized with the whole randomized controlled trials and experimentations on the poor. I want to hear your thoughts on what you make of that.
Thank you for that. Does anyone want to take that question?
I wish to address the question of our delegate about the social protection program being politicized. I wish to express my strong disagreement about the social protection program being politicized, because these programs are intended to establish fairness and equality in terms of opportunities of the people, specifically the workers in the informal sector. So I am really strongly committed about the social protection programs being implemented fairly and elevating the status of the people in the poverty line, the informal workers to be specific, to that of the formal workers, so that we address the problems on social injustice.
Florencia, turning to you, any comments on the politicization of social protections and/or innovative financing mechanisms?
Yes, some estimates from ILO from 2 or 3 years ago say that the estimated financing gap to guarantee social protection floors for all the people who are under cover today is 3% of global GDP. And it's interesting to see many proposals that have been put forth by the Universal Social Protection 2030 Alliance, where many UN agencies, NGOs, think tanks from around the world are putting forth a proposal for a global fund for social protection and how we could articulate this kind of organization to try to support countries who might have fiscal constraints to advance these kind of policies in terms of design, implementation, and financing of them. But I also think it's important to raise the point of investing in social protection as an investment and not as a cost, because as people thrive and as people reach better levels of well-being and have income security, this would also have economic returns in terms of inclusive economic growth and development. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we really do need to change the discourse around social protections as a cost and turn it into thinking about it as an investment. I want to make sure that Rufus and Saude have a minute to give your last comments. So we have 2 minutes. So Rufus, you first.
Yeah, maybe thanks a lot, Edwin, for this question on sustainability. I think for me, and putting on maybe perhaps a donor hat, because the challenge also still becomes that if you look at the humanitarian settings that are there, social protection is also the agencies or even the vehicles, modality that is being done. For instance, in Kenya, you'd find that it's WFP, the World Food Program, who then implements the social protection mechanism, but of course in partnership with the government. I think for me, like I mentioned before, how we linked also to the private sector is quite important. And even to be able then to eliminate, for instance, the challenge of politicization in the context of Kenya, and I know in most contexts, like even in Somalia, the issue of single registry. So you find that, for instance, yes, the government would outline the criteria, but like for instance, in the National Hunger Safety Net, a different kind of criteria and how much payout should be given maybe to the vulnerable populations, but then you also find a parallel system where the NGOs also have their own sort of criteria. So like in Kenya, you have 2 systems in terms of cash transfers, and then people, of course, the vulnerable populations, whether it's the people out in the arid and semi-arid areas, of course, they prefer the UN, they prefer the payout from the, because it's much higher than the government. So I think encourage and trying to make sure that in the conversations of a single registry, it's one that is government-led, because then that also creates a bit of sustainability. Maybe I might not want to answer on the rest, but that I just wanted to make sure that that's really plugged in. Thanks.
That's an excellent point. Saude, final thoughts.
So I would just like to say, in terms of sustainability, my view is that we need to move from, while we still have social assistance and social insurance programs, we also need to focus on the labor market interventions. We need to create jobs. We cannot continuously give out money forever. This should just be, they should be given when needed, not as a way to get people out of poverty. So we have a huge human resource in Nigeria. We're edging towards 200 million people. How do we give them jobs? How do we give them the skills required to set up on their own? How do we make their businesses better, their subsistence engagements better? I think we need to start looking that way, because the more people have jobs, the more they'll be able to contribute to their pensions, to their unemployment insurance, to the different transitions that they would need to have. So I think we need to move in that direction. And just as a final note, just to say that it's collective. Now everyone's talking about climate change. Africa is involved, the Global South is involved. We don't need to let the migration crisis and the different crises around the world get us to the point where we're all talking collectively around social protection. Because if people are doing well and they're thriving where they are, they won't need to move around looking for greener pastures. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think just as a final point, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think social protections can be the solution to everything. We have to fix the underlying problems that make people insecure, that make our entire system unequal and unsustainable, and addressing those underlying problems is going to be key. And in the meantime, social protections are really one of our most important tools. I really want to thank our panelists for this excellent discussion and for all of you for sitting through. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel.